All right, welcome back to another tutorial in Maya. Today, we're going to look at terrain and just how to build a simple terrain using what's known as a displacement map. Now, I've already done a tutorial about this quite a while ago, and there's some problems with it, yes, and there's some limitations, yes, but if you need geometry like this to sort of create a scene, this method is best used with compositing, and I'll show you why. Because this displacement map, what's giving us this terrain, actually looks something more like, well, it looks something more like this, just a flat plane with a displacement on it. So the displacement itself is giving us geometry. Now, in this scene, I placed a couple of elements, just some cylinders here to sort of see where, the map is taking us, so to speak. And I'll show you how that works. If I click on my alpha channel right here, you can see where my solid objects are and what, technically this would be compositing space behind here. So anything black, I'm going to be able to put something else behind here like a sky or clouds or whatever. But let's go back into the RGB view. This displacement map is kind of hard to navigate because it is flat. And that's kind of the limitation with this method, and we're going to take a look at how this is done. So anyway, let's take a look at these renders that I've done. I'm saving you a lot of time because I've done quite a few renders of this in various angles and whatnot. And you can kind of see where I've attached a color texture or just a JPEG image to the color channel. And I'm getting a little fractalization here on the close-up, but you can see the shadows and everything else come out fine when you use this method. So anyway, there's just another angle. Here it is from kind of a distance. You can see the plane here, and then here's that texture that I have attached. And I'm using the 3D texture called Crater. So that's what we're going to be using to look at this method. So anyway, you can see where it has all sorts of potential, and this is just a top view looking down, and here's another view. I basically have one directional light coming into the scene here, so there it is from the other side, and the directional light is coming straight down this way. So there it is. Okay, so you get the idea. I'm going to show you now what it looks like as we start out. This is what we're going to start with. A displacement map works with values. So anything white is the high value or the peak, and anything that's black is the low value, okay, or the depth, so to speak. So anyway, just keep that in mind. This is what we're building geometry from, a simple 2D image. And you can do these in Photoshop. You could custom paint a map in Photoshop and kind of use that for this same method that we're going to do today. But technically, this is what it looks like when you add the displacement node and do a render. So this little picture becomes this terrain, which is really cool, but it generates a very large topology, meaning there's a lot of triangles in here, and they may or may not be usable for, rendering. So the difference between this one to this one to this one has to do with varying the alpha values. And I'm going to show that to you right now so you're aware of this. I'm going to come over to my shading network that I'm using, and I'm going to take a look at, like, say, our crater 1. Okay, and let's move these out of the way for a second. In my crater 1, I have alpha gain at 4 and alpha offset at -4. Okay, and that's for my crater. And that's these values right here. If you vary them from 4 to -4 or 1 to -1, they're going to give you that varying topology. So this is like the -4, +4. This one right here is probably like a +2, -4. This one right here might just be a, +1, -1. So anyway, the higher you go with those alpha values, the more extreme your geometry will become. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, and we're going to go through this, so stay tuned. Here I just attached a texture, a color texture, to the color channel of that material. So no big deal. And that's what I get. Now, I also brought this same example over into the physical sun and sky system and just did some modifications and sort of made it, some active terrain just to kind of pre-visualize what it could look like in a scene. And that's that. Now, anything that has to do with shake, frequency, and melt is going to cause things like this. These are by raising the melt and the frequency and the shake and all that gives you something like that. Whereas we have some default values that are pretty good for, getting a good starting point for the geometry. So just something to keep in mind, okay? So that's varying some of the variables with that alpha offset and the alpha gain, and attaching some various color textures to the color channel. So let's get started right away and check this out. All right. So I'm going to move all this stuff aside, and I think what we'll do is just build a new network. So I'm going to just go to File, New Scene, and I don't need to say that. Let's just start up with a new scene. So let's create a plane. And there's our plane. And this is going to be what our terrain is going to be built from. So there it is, and I'm going to just bring that up off of the grid a little bit. Now, the first thing we got to do is make a plane with a bunch of, divisions. We don't just want 1 and 1. So let's switch our divisions up to, say, something more like 48 and maybe 48 there, and then take these up to just an even 24 height and width. All right. That gives us kind of an even, smooth mesh to start working with. And you can always raise these values up. And the more you raise these up, the more dense your mesh will become and the longer render times you will have. So there it is. So first thing we want to do is come over here and grab ourselves a blend, just a standard blend. I'm going to put that there. And actually, I'm going to go Graph, Clear Graph, and I'm going to come into my materials. And where'd my blend go? All right, well, it disappeared. So I'm going to create a blend. It's going to be called Blend 2. And that should be cool. I'm going to go ahead and select my plane, right mouse click, Assign Existing Material, and we'll go to that Blend 2. All right, and on this Blend 2, we want to grab a 3D texture. That's going to be our displacement texture, which is going to be our crater material. And we're going to attach that. Just go ahead and click on that, and then middle mouse button, drag and drop, and go to your default. And that puts it on the color channel. So now we can kind of take a look at over here. I'm going to turn my lights off. Turn the lights off. And now I can see there's my material. That's my Crater 1 material. And here is my 3D sort of placement node. That's going to be able to establish the height and depth. All right. So first off, let's look at this this crater material and take this crater. Go ahead and select it in the Hypershade right there, and we're going to work with this because we want these channels to be white and the middle channel to be sort of a mid-gray, and this channel 3 to be a pure black. And that's going to give us the basic height and then the depth, because we want black and white displacement. So that just visualizes everything for us a little better. So now that I got that, I want to take a look at this node right here. There it is. And expand it a little bit. Right now it's only giving us a 3D representation of this little area. So let's bring its scale up to say like 12, and I'll go 12, and I'm going to hit 12 there. And now you can see where you have a basic displacement on the plane, and we have, a node that covers that entire plane. All right, so that's just something important to know when you're working with this kind of method. And let's take a look at the Hypershade for a second over here, and you can see where the nodes are. I've got my crater, and we've got my blend. Now, the next thing we want to do with this is attach a displacement node. So I'm going to choose displacement over in my Hypershade. I'm going to click on that node, and there it is. So we have this, but we really need to connect this displacement node to the overall shading group. So In this case, I think the best way to go about this is to select the blend 2, go to graph, and we're going to graph the input-output connections. That way we can see this shading group node that otherwise we couldn't see if we didn't graph it. So when I chose that, my displacement node I created went away. I don't know where it is over here. There it is. No, that's our place 3D texture. So it's sort of gone. It's right here, actually. It shows up in the materials section. So I'm going to middle mouse button drag and drop that back down into the work area. And I'm going to activate it by clicking on it. And I want to middle mouse button, drag and drop it onto this Blend 2 SG and just connect it by default. And you can see where the connections that it made, that this displacement is on the overall shading network, which is cool. But we also want to take this crater 1, which is our, actual information right here, this displacement information. We want to take that crater 1 information and click on it, middle mouse button drag, and drop it on top of that displacement node as well. And you can see where that makes another connection, okay? So that's typically how this shading network is set up and how the displacement node is used in that. So now that we have that, you want to make sure that you come over into your crater 1 and go ahead and click that this is alpha is luminance, okay? So by enabling alpha is luminance, it's telling, the render that this should be 3D topology, or this will create our 3D, terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my render, and I'm going to bring the window over here. And if all goes well, you're going to see something that looks like this. Well, I'm going to switch my render settings. I'm going to click on my render settings there, and I'm going to set the quality up to something a little bigger. So let's go to production quality as a standard, and I think in my common section here, I'm going to make my preset at like HD 720 or something like that. That just will give us a little bit bigger picture here. So I'm going to go ahead and do another render. And note the render time down here, because with this method, you can rack up quite a bit of rendering time. So now it's at about 8 seconds. And you can see where the low areas or the black areas of our displacement node there are down here, and that our white is creating the peaks. So let's take a look at that, comparatively. I'll go ahead and shrink this window a little bit, and let's look at those. So you can really see a representation over here of what that 3D displacement node and map does when you attach it just to a simple plane, which is really cool. But that's where you have to be aware that we can make geometry out of this real easily by just selecting the plane and coming up to modify, come down to convert, and then convert that displacement to polygons. So essentially what Maya is going to do is it's going to think for a moment or two. So this could take a while depending on the size of geometry you have. And it's going to create a nice polygon rendering or polygon model of what this geometry is. But this may or may not be good to use, because in this case now, this geometry has a lot of faces. And let's take a look at that. I could do a render with just this on. And actually we might even do that, but you can see where there's just a million faces involved in this process of converting geometry into 3D terrain, and that's going to present problems on Maya's side for processing this stuff. So okay, I'm going to choose the image plane down here that I was working with before, and I'm going to hide that selection. And I'm going to just do a render. Let's do a render of this actual geometry right here. And I know you're going to have to sit through this with me, but, there it is. So as you can see, when I render this geometry, you're going to get lots of little weirdness things happening with, the faces on here. And that's kind of indicative of what happens when you create geometry for something like this. Now, the reason that you would want to use this geometry would be pretty much for, setting up a tracking point, or being able to kind of tell where your high points are and your low points are in order to sort of have a camera do a motion path, like a fly through, or if you had, you know, a landing or something like that happening in here. But typically, you won't be using this geometry in your overall renders, although you do notice that this right here renders out in about 4 seconds. So this topology went fairly quickly. We could try one of two things. I might want to select this geometry and come up into the mesh and sort of just do a smooth on this topology. So Maya is, of course, going to take another, you know, moment or two or 3, and it's going to go ahead and smooth that mesh, and that'll be the result. So let's take a look at what that did in our render view. I'm going to go ahead and save this raggedy render, basically, and we'll do a new render, and it may add a little more time for each smoothing process that you do, but, you know, technically, there it is. This is in about 11 seconds, which, you know, that's not too bad. I mean, it could be worse. All right. So that's something to look for on your actual geometry. And if you go to your outliner, let's see if I can get to my outliner from here. No, I'm going to have to get to the outliner from up here. I'm going to bring my outliner over. You can see where, you know, we have this is still part of the plane displacement system. I have my plane 1, which I hid, and now this plane 1 displacement 1 is my actual geometry. So, you know, at this point I could save this. I mean, I could use this, display it or not display it. It doesn't really matter. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and hide this for the moment. So I'm going to take this plane displacement and just go to display, hide selection. And that'll get it out of the way for the moment. It's still there. We can still use it. And everything is good to go. And I think in time being, I'm going to click on my plane that I hid. And I'm going to go to display. And we're going to show that selection. So let's go to show selection. And there it is. And we're going to take a look at a couple of things that are sort of peculiar to the overall displacement node. You know, this plane has that blend assigned, and we created that network. So let's come to the Hypershade and actually choose that blend. And let's look at a couple of things on here first. I want to sort of reduce the reflectivity because I don't really want my landscape to reflect anything. So the first thing I might do is bring that reflectivity down. And I also might want to come over to this crater and look at sort of our initial starting attributes. And these can be kind of important because they're going to give you various results. The shaker, if you just sort of play with that, you can see what it does in the viewport here. It sort of just varies the topology, and it sort of does what it does. So in this case, a good starting default might be anything from like 1.5 to 2. So I'm going to set the shaker at just default of 2, and we'll go with that. And down here, I'm going to, well, actually, no, let's do an extreme. Let's take this shaker way up, and let's take the melt value way up. And let's take, like, say, this frequency up a bit. And we'll do another quick render, and we're going to see kind of what that looks like. So you can play around with this as much as you want before you actually output that to, you know, geometry or convert it to polygons like what we did before. So really what you're seeing here are, you know, it looks pretty wonky. So you can tell the effects of moving this stuff around. Now let's take this down into some more reasonable values. Like I'll set the shaker at 2. I'll just set the melt to 0, balance at 0, and like this frequency, we'll bring the frequency, say, down. And I might want to move my render view there and take a look at what's happening over here. Set the frequency down, or in this case, I want some good depressions there, so I'll just go ahead and bring it to like 1.652. And let's make it a good 1.8. All right. And now I'll basically do another render, and you'll see right away that will give us a much better result. And then next thing we'll do is play around with this alpha gain and establish sort of some higher and lower points. So there's what we're starting with now. and I think we'll just reposition this a little bit. Okay, I'm going to come in here and reposition that, and now we'll do a bunch of renders. I'm going to go ahead and hit this and save out that image, and we'll do another one, and we're going to vary this alpha gain in the extreme. We're going to go from 1 point, there to like 4 positive and 4 negative, and we'll see what happens to this render. Already I'm getting a little bit longer times. There's about a 19-second render, and you can see the height and depth of the terrain with no lighting. This is just basic default. So let's go ahead and switch this alpha gain here to a positive 4 value and the offset to a negative 4. And you'll see right away that we've grown some terrain. And this technique can also be keyframed. So you can have terrain that basically grows over time. So remember that you can always take this alpha gain and set a keyframe on it at, say, 1, and then by the end of the animation go to a value of 4, and then take this alpha offset and go from, like, say, -1 to -4. And that would create corresponding geometry that would be growing or, sort of coming out of the earth. And so that is a powerful element you need to keep in mind, okay? So there it is. We now have a extreme version right there at the positive -4 value, and there's our 1 and 0 value. So pretty extreme difference. All right, so that's really cool. Now, what if we want to use this displacement map and we don't really want black and white values there necessarily, but we want more of a color value? Well, let's take a look in the Hypershade here real quick and take a look at our network. Technically, we don't need this crater information anymore from here because we do have it as a displacement, and we're just using this color to kind of give us an idea of what's going on in the displacement map. So I could always choose the blend and come into my blend in the tabs over here in your attribute editor, and come to the color and just put your cursor over the word color there and right mouse click and come down and break that color connection. You can see where it sort of broke the connection. So this crater is now no longer attached to the color channel. We can always put it back on there by just selecting it and dropping it and dragging it and hitting default, and it will go back to the plane there in default. So it's no big deal to reconnect that. So I'm going to basically come back to my blend 2. I'm going to go to the color, and I'm going to break that connection. And what we want to do is maybe attach a color overall to this blend, which will give our displacement map some color. You'll notice that when I take that color off of there, everything disappears. But don't worry, the geometry will still look like that. All right. So let's come over here into the Hypershade again and grab a 2D. Let's grab a 2D texture file, and here's our file. And I think I'll just open up a random. I'm going to click on this guy, and I'm going to open up a random texture. So I'm just going to choose something from one of these textures I have going on here, and I'll hit open. Okay, so it looks something like that. I'm going to go ahead and take this random texture and just middle mouse button, drag, drop it on top of the Blend 2 default, and there it is. So let's move this to the side, and let's move there's our texture in there. Let's see what it looks like as we do a render. So I'm going to go ahead and save that one, and we'll do another render, and we're almost done. So there's an infinite, number of ways to use this system, just depending on what you need to do. So there it is. Now you can see where this geometry has some color. You could do a custom painted texture in Photoshop or any other program. Just make sure it's a nice high quality, high res image, and you will get something that looks pretty cool. So that's with the texture on there. So let's just say that you're working on this project, and you can sort of always come to the color channel here and right mouse click and break that connection and reattach your other material. So I'm going to go ahead and click that on default. So now if I need to set up some animation moves or something in here, I now have this color texture to work with, so I know that, I want to kind of create my high points along the white areas in here. So anyway, it's a lot to take in. I hope I haven't bored you, and there you go. So that's kind of the ins and the outs of working with this system. So you'll end up playing around with it for a couple days and you'll get the hang of it. So hey, in the meantime, thanks for watching. Be a good person as always, and yes, read a book. This came straight out of the Autodesk manual, so it's cool information you can find in there. So get your hands on it if you can. Okay, so there you go. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you for the next one.